RSUs are usually the next rung up in terms of, hey, I'm building my career, I'm becoming more important to the firm. You start getting, they call them golden handcuffs, RSUs. Derek already touched a little bit on how, not how, but when they're taxed. So taxed when they vest, when they become yours versus when you sell them. But how the taxes are withheld varies dramatically different, like you talked about earlier, than the ESPP. Want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so whenever RSUs vest, they're taxed. They're also taxed whenever you sell, but there's no withholding at the point that you sell. It's just whenever they vest. And so there's statutory minimums or amounts, I'm going to say minimums, amounts that employers have to withhold. And for most people, that's 22% federal. Um, when RSUs vest, that's ordinary income, it's wage income, so like subject to Social Security, Medicare, all this stuff, just like a cash bonus would be. It's taxed
It's
essentially
literally
the
the
same
same
way. You
thing.
just get stock instead of
Yep.
whatever it's worth on the day that it vests, right? Instead of
Yep.
cash. So then 22% federal withholding typically. Then you have state and Social Security and Medicare if Social Security applies. But where you can get burned there is like, well, I've got my regular pay, I've got my cash bonus,
Yep.
I have these RSUs, and maybe I got a larger grant when I first came on board,
Yep.
or maybe the stock price has gone up a ton. So like I could have maybe there's a $100,000 target like bonus for my RSUs like on the grant date, but just to make it simple, let's say I have a 3-year cliff where all of that vests at once at the end of 3 years. Well, what was originally $100,000 is now worth $500,000 because the stock price has shot up. And so all of that hits a tax return at once on top of your salary, on top of your bonus. And you could be in a 32% tax bracket.
Not more.
And if they're just withholding 22%, that's what they're going to do.
Yep.
And so you either need to make an estimated tax payment or request additional withholding,
Yep.
with your W-4. But you can really get burned there on a huge unexpected tax bill.
Yep.
And the withholding doesn't change until you have $1 million of total compensation
Yep.
at the point that those RSUs vest, right? So
Yep.
like for most people, that's not really going to be a thing.
Right.
But imagine having like $800,000 of total wage ordinary
Yep.
income, and they're withholding 22% on these RSUs. Like, and it kind of came out of nowhere because it wasn't worth that,
Right.
when it was originally granted. So that's something that can definitely get away from you, like as you have additional grants, right? Or if you're in a graded schedule where it's
Yep.
like, okay, I get them every
Future
year,
planning.
and they vest every year or quarter, but now I've got 3 or 4 layered on top, and like now I am being pushed up into higher brackets. Like you really gotta
Yep.
have a good beat on what is my tax bracket with all of my compensation, my even like capital gains, all my income considered, and like am I withholding enough?
Yep. Biggest
Um,
biggest takeaway: your payroll adjusts based on how much you make. They do an estimate on how much you make to try to cover what your tax bill is going to be. RSUs, when they vest, they don't do that. They're just withholding this flat supplemental income amount that they have to hold. So you need to make sure that when you're doing some future planning, hey, what do we expect our income to be this year? Maybe I got a raise, maybe I got a bigger bonus, and we need to factor in how much RSUs are vesting. And a lot of folks don't know, like you mentioned, cliff vesting and graded vesting. There's all these different forms. A lot of folks don't take on that ownership of, hey, I know I'm going to have 20 grand a quarter for the next year, and knowing how much that needs to be set aside today to cover that gap.
the tricky part about it is like when you're selling ESPP stock, like, oh, there's probably going to
Yep.
be a tax event here.
Yep.
Or when you're exercising stock options, there's probably going to be a taxable event here. RSUs vest.
Yeah,
And
they're
like maybe
happening
even
in the
like miss.
background.
You're not even
Yeah.
that you don't have the pulse on that, right?
Yep.
And so that's why they're really easy to miss. I think, the other what I would consider the more common forms of equity comp that are less common than RSUs and SPP are stock options, and those could be non-qualified or
Yep.
incentive stock options, and
Agreed.
those are a whole other animal too. But um, just to briefly hit, when you exercise a stock option, that's what triggers on a non-qualified stock option. That's what triggers ordinary income. So I guess on the actual discount that you received, that's wage income. And then you can hold the stock after that or sell it right away. Then there's ISOs, and you got the whole other layer of
Yep.
AMT on
Yep.
top of that. And
Yep.
then there's strategies involved. And, there's AMT is another area where you can get really burned in that, like, if you exercise your stock options and you try to hold that stock for, 12 more months and try and get a qualifying disposition, and the price tanks, and Now, similar to the ESPP, where it's like, well, I've actually lost money on this, but I'm still going to be taxed on that discount. It's like with AMT, it's like, well, AMT tax applies on the spread of, what you bought it for relative to what the price was. And you can have an AMT tax due, even though if the stock price drops substantially, it's like, well, I don't have any ordinary tax due, but
Right.
shoot, I got hit with this AMT, and
your proceeds are less. and
it'll
you're
come
like-
back to me eventually. But like in that case, it could be like 20 years from now.
Right.
So like, I think the takeaway of all of this is like, please, like, don't.
Yep.
If you're at the point where equity comp is like a really meaningful part of your total compensation, like there are so many ways to fall into tax traps, have unexpected surprises or undesirable outcomes.
Yep.
Either because, maybe you're not aware of all the different mechanisms that go into those individually, but then also how all of them work together too.
Right.
It's just really important to be proactive in all of that and be thoughtful and like understand here is the outcome that I'm going to have if I do X or
Yep.
Y or Z or nothing, right?
Right.
And be able to make an informed decision on that instead of like,
Yep.
well, I need to sell some stock. I'll just pick
Yep.
that one
Right.
from this grant of this type.
Yeah.
There's just, and I'm not trying to fearmonger here, but like, yes, there's opportunities to fall in and have undesirable outcomes, or like on the flip side of that, of really missing out on opportunities to maximize what you have, right?
Yep.
And get the most out of it, which can have some real long-term consequences too. It's like, well, I
Right.
paid more in taxes than I needed to. It was still a good outcome, but
Yeah.
I could have done it in this way that was even better. So that's where we can really bring a lot to the table in terms of how does this fit big picture in my plan and what's the best tax outcome. And by the way, that might involve paying taxes today. It's not just about paying as little as possible today. It's
Big picture.
right, big picture, the greatest amount of after-tax dollars in your pocket,
Yep.
which is different than minimum taxes possible. Although RSUs are one of the simpler forms of equity compensation, they can be really sneaky because as those shares vest, that's what triggers a tax liability, and there's no action required from you in order for that to happen. And so that on top of withholding typically being at a default of 22% for federal, you can really get burned if your tax rate is much higher than that, not just like 24, but say it's 32, 35% plus. And so we've put together a really helpful calculator to kind of plug in some key aspects of your tax situation to help understand, am I over withheld or under withheld? Now, the best way to like really understand this is to do a full tax projection because there are just so many different moving pieces. But this is more helpful than a rule of thumb where you can jump in, put in your filing status, is it single, married, filing joint, head of household. Here's my regular salary. Here's what I expect for cash bonuses. Here's what's vesting for a particular RSU grant this year, my spouse's income, if that's applicable. And then subtract out standard deductions or itemized if you itemize, but then get a sense of, okay, well, here's all the withholding that I expect to have. Here's the withholding on these RSUs. Is there a chance like I'm going to have a pretty decent tax bill? Am I on track? So it's not as helpful as doing a full tax projection, but it's certainly a lot more helpful than a rule of thumb or just knowing what your marginal bracket is, because it's also important, what are you withholding with other compensation? Are you on track for that to be enough? Do you itemize or take the standard deduction? So there's a really helpful resource at the Plancorp website. It's this RSU calculator to kind of at least get a ballpark answer of, am I relatively on track with withholding, or do I need to make adjustments on my W-4 or perhaps make estimated tax payments because of the RSUs that I have vesting with a particular grant this year?